And so I would like to welcome Dr. Joseph Garcia, Deputy Chief Minister of Gibraltar, who will open this symposium for us. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here today and to open this 5th International Symposium here at the Garrison Library. The events under discussion over the 5 years that these events have taken place have placed a focus on issues that impact on Gibraltar and other territories within the context of a global and European framework. This year, the topic under the microscope is understanding referenda and self-determination in Europe. The subject of referenda seems all the more pertinent given the shifts that are taking place across Europe and the world today. I once again want to thank you, Jennifer, and thank her team for making this event a reality. And I particularly want to thank those of you who have come to Gibraltar from abroad. This year we have brought together a panel of 15 high-profile international and local speakers who will be putting their views forward during the 2.5 days of the symposium. This will include academics from Cambridge, King's College London, the University of Greenland, Aalborg University, Trinity College Dublin, University of the Faroe Islands, Brussels, University of Edinburgh, the University of Cadiz, the University of Birmingham, the University of Copenhagen, the University of Catalonia, and the University of Gibraltar. In recent times, as you know, referenda has been a pertinent topic, and even more so now with secession moves initiated in 2014 in Scotland and in Catalonia, now finding a fuller expression. It is also the case that the 2016 Brexit vote has generated much debate on the mechanics, if not the infectious nature of referenda, which has in turn opened up the possibility for other European states to debate moving forward in this way in order to determine their own position within Europe. The concept of self-determination and of referenda often go together, given that the latter is a mechanism which gives effect to the former. We'll be hearing more about these drives and their interconnectedness over the next few days. Because on the other hand, there are also referenda which have little to do with the question of self-determination. Simply exercising the right to choose is at the heart of a number of referendum initiatives. However, in a colonial context, the legality of this process under international law is unquestionable, although even then politics sometimes gets in the way. Gibraltar has suffered this injustice at first hand. The blunt reality is that the legal rights of a population listed by the United Nations as a non-self-governing territory are often sacrificed on the altar of political expediency under pressure from Spain. 50 years ago, on the 10th of September 1967, the people of Gibraltar were given a choice. That choice was to either remain British or to pass under Spanish sovereignty. The 1967 referendum marked the first time that the people of Gibraltar were given a say on their future. It was held against a background of increasing pressure by Franco's Spain, with restrictions by land, by air, and by sea. It took place against the wishes of the United Nations, which refused to recognize the vote or to send observers to it. On a turnout of 95.8%, 12,188 people voted to remain British, with only 44 voting for Gibraltar to become a part of Spain. This was a defining moment in our history. In 1704, Gibraltar fell to Anglo-Dutch Marines. In 1713, it became British in perpetuity by treaty. And in 1967, it became British by consent. In other words, that day Gibraltar was British because the people of Gibraltar wanted it that way. But the 1967 referendum had other important political consequences too. It led directly to the 1969 Constitution, which increased the level of self-government in Gibraltar. The United Kingdom, moreover, guaranteed in its preamble that the people of Gibraltar would never pass under the sovereignty of another state against their freely and democratically expressed wishes. Spain proceeded to cut off communications by land, by sea, and by telephone, and in 1969 Gibraltar became, to all intents and purposes, a city under siege. The background to the 2002 referendum was even more pertinent than that of 1967. In 1967, the people of Gibraltar defied both Spain and the United Nations. In 2002, they defied the United Kingdom as well. The referendum was a response to the plan of the Blair and Aznar government to share the sovereignty of Gibraltar between the UK and Spain. It was described as illegal. It was described as eccentric. It is important to note that although the UK was against the referendum, they did not want it to happen. No attempt was made to prevent the vote from taking place. There were no baton charges in Gibraltar. There were no attempts to close polling stations. There was no confiscation of ballot papers or ballot boxes. History has shown that violence and repression will never bury an ideal. So against a background of opposition, not only from Spain, but also from the UK, the people of Gibraltar were given the choice of accepting or rejecting the principle of shared sovereignty. And they overwhelmingly rejected it. And the so-called illegal and eccentric referendum put paid to the concept of shared sovereignty almost overnight. As happened in 1967, it also gave added impetus to the constitutional discussions which were to lead to a new constitution in 2006. At the same time, the UK agreed what is known as the double lock, that they would not even enter sovereignty discussions in the future with which Gibraltar was not content. The Gibraltarians have since remained steadfast in their resolve to exercise their right to self-determination in order to secure removal from the United Nations list of non-self-governing territories. We put our views to the UN committee that deals with decolonization every June, and to the fourth committee every October. As such, the themes under discussion in this symposium are very pertinent to the ongoing debates taking place in Gibraltar, in the United Kingdom, and indeed in Europe. These are universal topics, and we will see as the next few days unfold that the question of self-determination is also an important factor in other territories and states in Europe, although clearly in a different context. Indeed, the historical connections between Gibraltar and Catalonia are noted. Although the legal positions are clearly very different, we share a point of departure with the 1713 Treaty of Utrecht. This historical nexus remains a factor in present-day articulations of self-determination. We find ourselves here today discussing referenda on the 50th anniversary of Gibraltar's momentous sovereignty referendum, a year after the Brexit vote, and we do so in the throes of the present situation in Catalonia. In the course of the next few days, you will be hearing from Catalan delegates who will be speaking on this question from both legal and political perspectives. I would also like to welcome a fellow parliamentarian from the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands are working towards a 2018 referendum on the Faroese constitution, and we will be learning more about Faroese self-government and their links with Denmark. The picture that unfolds here is one of commonalities between certain territories in Europe. And the truth is that we have much to learn from each other, given in a number of cases our shared history, but also the shared moves towards greater autonomy and self-government. History is certainly at the heart of many of the themes under discussion, and at the risk of tagging on to the cliché of history repeating itself, perhaps we can give this a certain inflection by referring to Umberto Eco, who once said that everything is repeated in a circle. History is a master because it teaches us that it doesn't exist. It is the permutations that matter. Challenging as Eco's words are, the permutations underpinning the dynamics of history are key. And it is not sufficient to suggest that the present is part of a repetitive process, but rather, and perhaps more significantly, informed by changes and transformations. A number of today's historical papers will look at the history of the British Empire, offering us perspectives on plebiscites taking place at the same time as Gibraltar was preparing for its 1967 referendum. This context would help situate our referendum within a wider historical time frame, as part of the post-World War II drives towards decolonization, a drive which Gibraltar remains caught up in, but which also draws attention to the changing framework underpinning notions of empire in this 21st century. Indeed, it is curious to note that Malta and Cyprus became independent at around the same time as Gibraltar voted to remain British. The papers on the 1967 Gibraltar referendum will engage with these dynamics in more detail, offering both a historical and present-day perspective on events as they unfolded in that crucial year. Europe's colonial legacy will also be discussed across a number of papers which focus on, as mentioned earlier, the Faroe Islands and additionally Greenland. The Greenland example is interesting, not only in terms of the 2008 referendum, in which Greenland voted for increased self-government in relation to Denmark, but also on how a post-colonial identity is being articulated. The Greenland example is also interesting given Greenland's exit from the European Union in 1982, when by almost exactly the same margin as the 2016 UK Brexit vote, Greenland chose to leave the then EEC. The Greenland example is one that has resurfaced in the light of last year's Brexit referendum, when there was talk of this reverse Greenland option, with those parts of the United Kingdom family that wished to remain in the European Union doing so, and those parts that wanted to leave, leaving. In Gibraltar, as you know, we voted by 96% to remain in the European Union. We do not want to leave the European Union, but we're now in discussions to leave. And during that referendum, 19,322 people voted to remain, compared to 823 who voted to leave. Gibraltar was always expected to be strongly in favour of staying in the EU, and was the first seat to declare. As such, the wider discussion of Brexit here, and on the back of the 2016 referendum, seems all the more pertinent, given that Brexit itself is part of an ongoing dialogue replete with permutations of its own. Placing Brexit into a historical context, which Professor Holland from King's College London will do later this morning, will provide a framework for the understanding of Europe's historical aspirations. This has ranged from federalism, on the one hand, to sovereign independent nation states, to a Europe of the regions and the positions at play today. To be discussed during the symposium will be papers on Scotland post-Brexit, and the questions raised over a second independence referendum in Scotland, which remains moot. The results of the Brexit referendum also drew attention to the mechanics of referenda and voting practices, a subject which will be discussed over the course of the symposium, as will constitutional reform. These topics will be analysed as part of the wider debate on Brexit, which includes papers on the impact of Brexit on Gibraltar, as well as Spain's perspective on a post-Brexit Europe. And I leave you with this thought. The nation-state is a relatively new concept in certain parts of Europe. Modern Italy became a nation-state only in 1861, when most of the Italian states and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies united under Victor Emmanuel II of Savoy. 10 years later, in 1871, Kaiser Wilhelm I was proclaimed as a leader of a newly united Germany. All this was less than 160 years ago. For centuries before, Europe, continental Europe, comprised a patchwork of city-states and a myriad of sovereign regional entities ruled by the Pope, by kings, by dukes, and by electors. It is true that the famous pendulum I mentioned earlier has swung in different directions at different points in European history. By 1992, the Soviet Union had split up into 15 different countries. On the 1st of January 1993, Czechoslovakia split up peacefully into two separate nations, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Yugoslavia split up into Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro in 2006, and Kosovo in 2008. We do not know the direction that Europe will take in the future. This could range from that federal superstate I mentioned earlier to a collection of regional entities on the other, or indeed to something else in between. However, we do know with certainty that this future reality must be determined freely and democratically by the people affected. The essence of self-determination and of referenda is that people come first. Thank you.